In the summer of 1209, a papal legate asked a question that should have frozen Europe. How do we know which villagers are heretics? A commander answered with words that would echo for centuries. Kill them all. God will know his own. And the church agreed. This wasn't a crusade against Muslims or pagans or distant empires. It was a holy war against Christians. Where faith became a weapon, the church turned inward. The Albigensian Crusade began with a corpse. A papal envoy, Pierre de Castelnau, found dead beside a riverbank in January 1208. No witnesses, no weapon, no confession. In medieval Europe, murders were common. Disputes between nobles and clergy happened constantly. By all logic, this should have been a small local scandal. But Rome doesn't think in small. Rome thinks in symbols. And the death of a papal envoy was the perfect symbol. A single strike in the dark that could justify a war in the light. Pope Innocent III seized it immediately. Not because he knew who killed Castelnau, but because he knew who could be blamed. And blame is the seed from which crusades grow. To understand why a single death ignited a holy war, you must understand what terrified the church most in the early 13th century. Competing versions of Christianity. The Cathars were not pagans. They were Christians, devout, disciplined, uncompromising. They believed in purity. They rejected wealth. They refused to swear oaths. They criticized corruption. Everything the church struggled with. The Cathars exposed by simply existing. Worse, people admired them. Nobles respected them. Villagers trusted them. Merchants protected them. Rome saw all of this and realized something chilling. The Cathars were winning hearts in ways the church no longer could. So when Castelnau died, it didn't matter who killed him. Rome's fear had already chosen its culprit. The south of France had a powerful lord. Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse, not a Cathar, not a heretic, but dangerously tolerant. He allowed Cathars to preach. He protected them from persecution. He refused to hand over his subjects to inquisitors. To Rome, that tolerance was treason. When Castelnau died, rumors spread instantly. Raymond VI ordered it. His men did it. He wanted to silence Rome. No proof, no investigation. Just whispers that grew louder every hour until Innocent III declared them truth. Raymond VI was excommunicated, his lands declared contaminated, his honor stripped in a single decree. And the Pope made an announcement that stunned Europe. A crusade will cleanse the South. Not a crusade against Saracens. Not a crusade against infidels. A crusade against Christians. Rome believed the people of Occitania would abandon the Cathars immediately to avoid punishment. They miscalculated. The South was culturally different from the North. They valued debate. They tolerated difference. They believed faith should persuade, not force. Their nobility was independent. Their clergy was intertwined with daily life, not hierarchy, so when Rome demanded that every suspected Cathar be handed over, the South refused, not because everyone agreed with Cathar teachings, but because everyone agreed with something deeper. Faith should not need an army to defend itself. This defiance stunned Rome. These were not Muslims refusing conversion. They were Christians refusing obedience. And disobedient Christians were far more dangerous because they undermined the Church from within. Innocent III was not just a pope. He was a strategist. He saw what others didn't. If Southern tolerance continued, Europe would fracture into regions with different Christian interpretations. Not heresy, not rebellion. Something worse. Pluralism. A world where Christianity was not controlled from Rome. And Innocent III understood that once faith becomes decentralized, it never returns. He believed the Church was fighting not for theology, but for survival, and survival requires enemies. So he painted the Cathars as a cancer that must be cut out entirely, not cured, not debated, erased. In 1209, Innocent III issued a call that swept across Europe. All who take up arms against the heretics shall receive the same indulgence as those who fight in the Holy Land. Suddenly, the crusade had divine approval, political cover, economic incentive, spiritual reward, and permission to seize land from heretics. For northern French nobles struggling with land hunger, this was irresistible. They could kill their neighbors, steal their lands, and walk away forgiven. For mercenaries, it was a paycheck from heaven. For opportunists, it was a shortcut to power. And for ambitious lords, it was a chance to break the independent southern nobility. A holy war wrapped around a political conquest. Faith as armor, power as sword. By summer, an army of nearly 12,000 Crusaders assembled in Lyon. They marched not toward Jerusalem, but toward Béziers, a Christian city full of Christian families who had committed only one crime: refusing to betray their neighbors. Behind them marched priests ready to judge. Behind them marched opportunists ready to seize land. And above them all loomed the decree of a pope who believed unity was worth any price, even the blood of Christians. This was no longer a spiritual dispute. It was a collision course between faith and power. A crusade headed not for a distant desert, but for the heart of Europe itself. The papal army didn't march like crusaders heading east. They marched like executioners walking toward a verdict. 12,000 soldiers from northern France, knights hungry for land, mercenaries promised absolution, and bishops traveling with them, not to preach, but to judge. Their target was the city of Béziers, a place where Catholics and Cathars lived side by side and refused to betray each other. To Rome, that loyalty was proof of corruption. To the Crusaders, it was treason. And as the army approached, it became clear that this crusade was unlike any before it. There was no attempt to separate faithful from heretic. No negotiations, no lists of suspects. Just one order. If they protect the heretics, they become heretics. A perfect moral trap. A city of 10,000 people, mothers, craftsmen, priests, children, suddenly placed outside the protection of Christian law. When word reached Béziers that a Crusader army was approaching, panic spread. But so did something else. Defiance. Town leaders begged the Cathars to flee, if only to save the Catholic majority who would pay the price. But the Cathars refused. They would not run. They would not betray their neighbors. And they would not admit guilt for something they never believed was a crime. So the Catholics made a decision Rome never predicted. They chose to stand with the Cathars. No city in medieval Europe was supposed to do that. cities surrendered to Crusades. They didn't argue with them. But Béziers was different. It was wealthy, proud, and strongly fortified. A city convinced that right could still defeat might. They were wrong. The Bishop of Béziers sent envoys carrying a simple message. Spare our people. We will identify the heretics. Let justice be done properly. A reasonable offer. A Christian offer. The Crusaders rejected it immediately. Their leader, the papal legate Arnaud Amalric, responded with chilling clarity. Your city harbors heretics. Your walls protect them. So your walls will fall. The envoys left in silence. They knew what that meant. Everyone inside Béziers did. Inside the city, debate turned into chaos. Some demanded surrender. Others called surrender a betrayal of their faith. The Catholics believed giving up the Cathars would damn their souls. The Cathars believed surrendering would damn their principles. It wasn't a dispute between religions. It was a dispute about the meaning of Christianity itself. And in that moment, Béziers became the epicenter of Europe's deepest spiritual conflict. Is obedience to Rome more important than the teachings of Christ? That question split families, split neighborhoods, split the city. But they ran out of time. On July 22, 1209, the Crusader army surrounded Béziers. The plan was simple: lay siege, starve the city, force a surrender. But something happened that the Crusaders did not expect. A group of young, hot-headed defenders, eager to prove their courage, rushed out of the gates to taunt the enemy. It was supposed to be symbolic, a show of confidence. Instead, they left the gate open. The Crusaders charged. Béziers fell in minutes. Not hours, not days, not weeks. Minutes. The city that believed faith would protect it had been undone by youthful pride. A mistake so small, so human, yet catastrophic. As Crusaders poured into the streets, soldiers asked the papal legate the question they feared most. How do we separate Catholics from Cathars? Amalric's answer was simple. Kill them all. God will know his own. It wasn't a metaphor. It wasn't a threat. It was a policy. Crusaders swept through the city like a storm without a direction, cutting down everyone they saw. Beggars, priests, craftsmen, mothers, children. Some hid in the cathedral, believing no Christian army would dare violate a house of God. They were wrong. Crusaders set it on fire. And as flames devoured the church, the bells rang, not to warn, not to call for help, but because the heat was so intense, the metal began to buckle and scream. By nightfall, Béziers was gone. 10,000 Christians dead. Killed not in the name of a foreign god, but in the name of their own. The massacre of Béziers wasn't a military victory. It was a warning, a message to every Christian city in Europe. Your loyalty to Rome matters more than your loyalty to each other. A message that obedience was not optional, and mercy was negotiable. The crusade had begun not with a battle, but with an erasure, and Béziers was only the first. Because the army now marched south toward a city far larger, far richer, and far more determined to resist. Carcassonne, where the Crusaders would discover that fear is a weapon that cuts both ways. News of Béziers reached Carcassonne long before the Crusaders arrived. The message was clear: surrender or share their fate. But Carcassonne wasn't Béziers. It was one of the strongest fortresses in Europe. Double walls, high towers, endless water supply, enormous granaries. And its ruler, Raymond Roger Trencavel, was not a man who bowed easily. He was young, proud, brilliant in diplomacy. And worst of all for Rome, he protected both Catholics and Cathars under his rule. To the church, that made him a heretic by association. To the people, it made him beloved. Fear should have broken Carcassonne. Instead, it unified them. When the Crusader army appeared on the horizon, no one talked about surrender. They talked about survival and revenge. The fall of Béziers had transformed the Crusaders. They were no longer a collection of nobles chasing absolution. They had become something darker, an army convinced that God himself wanted blood. The Pope's legate explained to them, Béziers was not a tragedy. It was purification. Carcassonne, he insisted, was the real test. A city that defied Rome openly. A stronghold where heresy thrived in the open sun. The Crusaders marched with one goal: break Carcassonne and break the entire region. The stakes had changed. This wasn't just a siege. It was a message, a warning to every Christian who questioned Rome's authority. Unlike Béziers, Trencavel didn't wait. He sent envoys to negotiate, not out of fear, but strategy. His offer was bold. He would open his gates to Catholic clergy. He would host open debates between Cathar leaders and church officials. He would investigate the murder of the papal legate. And he would guarantee safe passage for all Crusaders entering peacefully. He thought dialogue would calm the storm. But diplomacy had died at Béziers. The Crusaders imprisoned his envoys. Negotiation was over. This wasn't about finding heretics. It was about crushing an example. And Carcassonne was the brightest one. On August 1st, 1209, the Crusaders launched their first attack on the city walls. It failed instantly. Arrows cut down the front lines. Boiling oil rained down. Stone throwers shattered siege towers. Carcassonne stood firm. The Crusaders realized something terrifying. This city could not be taken by brute force. So they chose a different weapon: time. They surrounded Carcassonne completely. Cut off the rivers, cut off roads, cut off food, cut off hope. But the worst blow was not military. It was psychological. Refugees from Béziers, traumatized, starving, desperate, were driven into the fields between the two armies. Trencavel tried to open his gates to save them. The Crusaders attacked anyone who approached. For days, the people of Carcassonne watched children die in the sun, not from swords, but from thirst. This was no longer a siege of walls. It was a siege of faith itself. By mid-August, the city was weakening. Stores were shrinking, disease spread, morale cracked. But what doomed Carcassonne wasn't hunger. It was betrayal. A secret tunnel, known only to a handful of citizens, led beneath the walls and out toward the countryside. It was meant to be used in emergencies for communication or escape. Someone told the Crusaders, "We will never know who." A frightened citizen, a bribed guard, a desperate Cathar hoping to flee. But overnight, the Crusaders blocked the tunnel exits. Carcassonne's only hope of resupply vanished. From that moment on, the city was living on borrowed time. On August 14th, Realizing his people could not endure another week, Trinqueval proposed a personal meeting. He left his fortress unarmed and walked into the Crusader camp to negotiate peace. He believed honor still existed between Christian lords. He was wrong. The moment he arrived, Crusader leaders ordered him imprisoned. A violation of medieval law, a violation of Christian codes, a violation of every rule of noble conduct. Trinqueval had come to talk. The Crusaders had come to end this. He died in captivity weeks later, officially of illness, unofficially of despair. Carcassonne never recovered. With their lord imprisoned, the city surrendered. But here is the twist history often forgets. The Crusaders didn't burn Carcassonne. They didn't slaughter its people. They evicted them. Every man, woman, and child was forced to leave with only the clothes they wore. Why? Because Rome didn't want a massacre. Not this time. They wanted occupation. Carcassonne, the jewel of Occitania, was given not to a pious saint, but to a northern French noble loyal to Rome. This crusade was never about saving souls. It was about seizing land. Faith was the banner. Power was the goal. The army moved on, and the Albigensian Crusade was only entering its most brutal phase. Because next, the Crusaders would face an enemy they could not simply starve, burn, or intimidate. They would face an entire culture that refused to die quietly. With Carcassonne captured, the Crusaders realized something dangerous. They didn't need to win battles. They only needed to drain the land dry. The Albigensian Crusade shifted from warfare to systematic erasure. No more quick assaults. No more shocking massacres like Béziers. This phase would be slower and far more destructive. A war not against armies, but against culture, against language, against identity, against the idea that Christianity had room for disagreement. Rome wasn't just purifying heresy. It was reshaping southern France in the image of northern French nobility. Faith had become a blueprint for conquest, but the south did not surrender quietly. Cities like Minerve, Termes, Cabaret, Lavaur, small strongholds perched on impossible cliffs, refused to bow. They had no armies, no reinforcements, often not even stone walls. All they had was conviction. Cathars and Catholics alike believed their land was worth more than Rome's promises of forgiveness. These towns weren't strategic targets. They weren't supply centers. They weren't military threats. They were symbols, and symbols, in holy wars, are the first things that must die. Minerve was a tiny fortress compared to Carcassonne, barely a dot on the map. But to the Crusaders, it was the perfect laboratory. Simon de Montfort, the northern noble who had become the iron fist of the crusade, led the attack. He didn't want a quick victory. He wanted a spectacle, a demonstration of what happened when a city sheltered Cathars and refused to confess guilt. He surrounded Minerve and began a slow, crushing siege. Weeks passed. Water ran low, food dwindled, hope decayed. Eventually, Minerve surrendered. But Montfort wasn't satisfied. The Cathar perfects, the spiritual leaders of the movement, were offered a choice: convert or burn. Almost every one of them chose fire. They walked into the flames singing. Montfort watched in silence, seeing not martyrs, but proof of purity so strong it terrified him. Because people willing to die for their beliefs are harder to defeat than armies. Simon de Montfort became the central figure of the crusade. To Rome, he was a hero. To the south, he became a myth. A man whose shadow fell across every village from Toulouse to Narbonne. He seized land from nobles who questioned the crusade. He replaced local lords with northern allies. He built a new political order under the banner of God's will. Every victory made him more powerful. Every surrender made him more ruthless. He believed he was chosen, and chosen men do not compromise. Montfort waged a war not of tactics, but of pressure. Villages were burned not to force surrender, but to force conformity. Every Cathar house razed, every dispute settled by papal decree, every noble pressured to swear loyalty not to their land, but to Rome. The crusade had become a machine. Montfort was its engine, and the south was drowning. While battles raged, another war unfolded quietly. A political war? The French crown watched the crusade with interest. If Rome crushed the southern lords, Paris would gain enormous influence. The south was wealthy, rich farmland, thriving trade, independent culture. To the monarchy, the crusade was a divine excuse to expand its power. Rome wanted spiritual control. Paris wanted political control. They didn't need to coordinate. They only needed the war to continue long enough to break the region's resistance. The Cathars weren't just fighting for theology. They were standing between their homeland and two rising powers who both believed they had God's mandate. If Béziers was a massacre and Carcassonne was a conquest, Lavaur was something worse. A message. The fortress of Lavaur refused to surrender. Its lady, Guiraud de Laurac, a noblewoman respected across the region, held the castle for as long as she could. When it fell, Montfort ordered. The castle's defenders hanged. 400 Cathars burned alive. Lady Guiraud thrown into a well and crushed with stones, not because she was a military threat, not because she killed Crusaders, but because she had become a symbol of resistance. Montfort didn't want her alive. He wanted her erased. After Lavaur, the war changed. Villages surrendered out of terror. Nobles abandoned their lands. Priests fled south or hid their beliefs. The crusade no longer needed victories. Fear did the fighting, despite everything. Béziers, Minerve, Lavaur, dozens of burned villages, the rise of Montfort, the political pressure from Paris, the threats from Rome, the South still would not fully collapse. Why? Because the Cathars had something the Crusaders could not kill. A moral idea. The belief that the Church had lost its way, that purity existed outside Rome, that Christianity could be simple, humble, and free from hierarchy. People do not surrender ideas like that just because armies tell them to. The Crusaders could destroy fortresses. They could burn towns. They could erase families. But they could not erase conviction. And conviction would soon give birth to a resistance movement Rome never wanted to fight. A movement that would turn the greatest crusader of the campaign from conqueror into prey. Because next comes the moment no one expected. The South fights back with a fury Rome had never imagined. After Béziers, Carcassonne, Minerve, and Lavaur, Rome believed the South was broken. But the opposite was happening. The more pressure the Crusaders applied, the more united the region became. For the first time in generations, Catholics, Cathars, nobles, peasants, merchants, All began to see Montfort not as God's instrument, but as an invader. A foreign lord stealing their land, crushing their customs, and ruling in the name of a distant pope who had never walked their soil. Faith had ignited the crusade. Identity would ignite the rebellion. And the South discovered something Rome feared. They had more to fight for than the Crusaders had to conquer. In the background of all this stood Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse, the most powerful lord in the region, excommunicated by Rome and forced into exile. Rome believed removing him would collapse the South. Instead, it turned him into a symbol, a lord punished not for heresy, but for refusing to hand his land to northern barons. When the people of Toulouse rose up against the harsh rule of Montfort, they sent messengers to find Raymond VI. He returned in triumph. Crowds filled the streets. Cathedrals rang their bells. Even many Catholics saw his return as the return of justice itself. Raymond VI had no army, but he had something better: a population ready to fight. Simon de Montfort understood the danger immediately. If Toulouse rebelled, the entire crusade could unravel. So he marched on the city with the brutality he had perfected over years of war. Villages along the route were burned, fields destroyed, crops stolen, livestock slaughtered. Montfort believed terror would choke the rebellion in its cradle. He had forgotten the lesson every conqueror eventually learns. Fear controls individuals. It does not control nations. The rebellion began small. A garrison at Auteuil, held by Crusader knights, was ambushed by local militias. Artisans, farmers, former Cathar sympathizers, minor nobles whose lands had been seized. They overwhelmed the Crusader troops using guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run strikes, night assaults, and ambushes along forest roads. It wasn't a decisive victory, but it was the first proof that Montfort's army was not invincible. The South began to believe, and belief is the one weapon Montfort never learned how to fight. Inside Toulouse, Raymond VI began organizing something unprecedented: a citizen army. Not professional soldiers, not mercenaries, not knights, ordinary people. Armored in old equipment, armed with homemade weapons, driven by a fury no crusade could erase. Women joined supply lines. Priests forged alliances. Craftsmen built siege engines in secret. Former Cathars, hunted for years, now acted as scouts and informants. For the first time, the crusade was no longer one-sided. The South had learned to fight back. Montfort marched on Toulouse, expecting a quick surrender. What he found instead was a city fortified not by walls, but by will. Every gate barricaded, every tower manned, every street prepared for combat. Montfort began a siege as he had done countless times before. But this time, he was fighting an enemy who knew his tactics intimately. They used countermining to collapse his siege tunnels. They destroyed his towers with fire. They launched sorties at night. The more Montfort pushed, the more Toulouse adapted. He had turned the region into survivors. Now, they would teach him the cost of survival. On June 25th, 1218, during an assault on the walls, Montfort personally led an attack to break the defenders. He believed the people of Toulouse would crumble if they saw their leader. He was half right. They did not crumble. They aimed. As Montfort advanced, a group of women on the walls, assisting the city's engineers, loaded a massive trebuchet. They fired, A stone struck Montfort directly. He collapsed instantly. The man who had burned, conquered, and terrorized the South for years died not by a knight's blade, but by the hands of ordinary citizens, women defending their home. With Montfort's death, the crusade shattered. His army fractured, leadership dissolved, momentum collapsed. The invincible conqueror had been defeated by a city that refused to surrender its soul. Montfort's death was more than a battlefield loss. It was a spiritual turning point. For years, Crusaders believed God guided Montfort's victories. Now, they asked a quieter question. If God wanted this crusade, why did he let Montfort fall? Doubt spread among Crusader ranks. Desertion followed. Local nobles reclaimed their lands. Raymond VI re-established authority. For the first time, the South held the advantage. But Rome was not finished, because the Church had a weapon even more powerful than an army: time. And while the South celebrated, Rome was already planning the next phase of the war, a phase no rebellion could endure. When Simon de Montfort fell, the crusade should have died with him. His army fractured. His lieutenants argued. Loyalty dissolved overnight. But Rome didn't panic. Rome never panics. Because Rome does not need quick victories. Rome only needs time. And time was the one weapon the South did not have. The cities had burned crops to survive. Villages had lost men for years. Toulouse was exhausted. Carcassonne was occupied. Trade was strangled. The rebellion had heart. But heart cannot refill granaries or rebuild armies. While the South struggled to breathe, Rome simply waited. They knew hunger does the work no Crusader's sword ever could. Then came the turning point the South could not withstand. The French monarchy joined the crusade, not out of faith, not out of loyalty to Rome, but because the crown saw opportunity. If the crusade succeeded, the King of France would gain enormous southern territories, wealthy cities, strategic trade routes, weakened rival nobility, and cultural dominance from Paris to the Pyrenees. For the monarchy, the crusade was not a holy war. It was a land grab blessed by the Pope, a perfect alliance. France supplied armies. Rome supplied justification. Together, they became unstoppable, while the people of Toulouse rebuilt. A new Crusader army assembled in the north, larger, richer, better supplied than anything Montfort ever commanded. There were no fiery sermons, no triumphant marches, just a cold, methodical preparation for total conquest. In 1226, King Louis VIII formally declared the South a rebellious and dangerous region infected by heresy. He marched with royal troops, knights, engineers, and siege masters. Unlike Montfort, Louis VIII did not aim to terrorize. He aimed to absorb. The war was no longer spiritual. It was administrative. Every city that surrendered kept its population, but lost its freedom. Every noble who resisted lost his lands. Every Cathar who survived went into hiding. This crusade did not rage like a fire. It spread like frost. Slow, inevitable, unstoppable. After his father's death, Raymond VII inherited the cause. Brilliant, charismatic, and beloved by the South, he led one final wave of resistance. He retook lands lost to Montfort, reanimated old alliances, fought the French crown village by village. For a moment, a brief, fragile moment, it seemed the South might rise again. But Raymond VII faced an enemy even his courage could not defeat. Diplomacy backed by overwhelming force. Paris offered a deal. Submit to the crown, accept royal overseers, hand over Cathar strongholds, and the war would end. Refuse, and the region would burn again. Raymond VII signed, not because he wanted peace, but because his people could not endure another generation of war. It was the moment Rome had waited for. The rebellion ended not with a battle, but a compromise. A compromise made with a knife at the throat. But Catharism did not die. Its last defenders retreated to a fortress perched on a mountain, Montségur. A place so high, so isolated, so impossible to attack, it became the beating heart of the surviving movement. For 10 months, French royal forces surrounded it. They cut off food, cut off water, cut off hope. But the defenders refused to surrender. When the fortress finally fell in 1244, over 200 Cathars were given a choice: convert or burn. They chose fire. They walked into the flames without chains, without fear, without hesitation. Witnesses said they held hands as they burned. The Crusaders expected screams. What they heard instead was singing. Montségur did not end Catharism. Montségur turned it into a legend Rome could not kill. By 1250, the Albigensian Crusade was over. The south was broken, its lords replaced, its lands absorbed into the French kingdom, its culture suppressed, its archbishoprics brought under stricter Roman authority. Rome had achieved its goal. Heresy crushed, territory secured, nobility subdued, influence expanded. On paper, it was a triumph. But history does not measure victories in territory alone. Some victories cost more than they give. And Rome had paid dearly, because the world saw what the Church was willing to do to its own children. And the stain of Béziers, Minerve, Lavaur, and Montségur would never wash away. The Albigensian Crusade did not reshape the Middle Ages because of its battles. It reshaped it because of its mirror. It forced Christendom to look at itself and ask a question it feared to answer. How far can faith go before it stops being faith and becomes power? Rome claimed it fought for purity, for truth, for the soul of Europe. But when the greatest crimes of the Crusade were committed, they were committed not against infidels, but against Christians, Christians who prayed, who loved, who believed, but believed differently. The Church won the land. It won obedience. It won silence. But it lost something far greater. It lost the moral certainty that had once made people trust it. Because no matter how many chronicles try to soften the story, no matter how many sermons try to justify the violence, the memory of Béziers remains. A city where Christians slaughtered Christians in the name of the same God. And the memory of Montségur remains. A mountain where people walked willingly into fire because Rome could not allow them to exist. The crusade ended. The Cathars vanished. But the question endured. What does it mean when an institution claiming divine authority must burn believers to preserve itself? The Albigensian Crusade did not kill Catharism. It revealed something far more unsettling. That faith becomes most dangerous not when it is challenged, but when it is certain. And in that certainty, an entire world was rewritten. Not by pagans, not by infidels, but by the very church that vowed to defend the light. The South never recovered, Europe never forgot, and history never forgave.